All right, hello everybody. Today I am talking about the final book in the Skylark series. Finally, I was looking through my list of stuff to look at and I was like, oh, I never finished the Skylark series. So this is the fourth book in the Skylark series, Skylark DuQuesne. Actually, from what I read, this is Doc Smith's last book, serialized in 1965 and published in book form a year later. So there are a couple of different versions of this book on the Internet Archive. I read the 1966 Pyramid edition, which unfortunately actually has a few major typesetting errors. I saw three of them, but I really only bookmarked one of them, so bear with me. But basically what would happen is that there would be a line that would be repeated and it would overwrite text somewhere else on the page. So, somewhere on the page there's this line, and then somewhere above or maybe below, that line would be repeated, and it would and whatever was supposed to be under it would get destroyed. So I found that. I found two other later versions, one from Jove or HBJ Publishing, and another from Panther, which came later, which appear to fix at least the error that I bookmarked. So I don't know if they got all three of them, but it's better than the Pyramid edition, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for these editions. Now, this book, we've gone through three of these books already. We have Richard Seaton and Friends. We have Mark DuQuesne and colleagues, I guess. These books they were originally written starting in 1928, and then were written, 1, 2, and 3. That is Skylark of Space, Skylark 3, which is actually the second book, and Skylark of Valeron were all written between 1928 and the mid-1930s, I think. And this one was written much, much later. This was written in 1965. And so it's a very different feeling from the other three books in a lot of ways. I'll get to that in a minute, but let's do a quick spoiler-free plot summary, or plot, inward. So, like a lot of Doc Smith books, this one starts with a crazy revelation that kind of retcons something that happened in the previous book. The method that they used at the end of Skylark of Valeron to trap DuQuesne and those weird bodiless intelligences probably won't last as long as they thought they discover or they realize. And this is kind of a common element in Smith's stories. Something at the end of a previous book gets recontextualized or even recanted to put into more fun or more interesting or just more open to other things happening later on points. So in short, the idea behind this book is that DuQuesne might be coming back. Of course he is. The book is called, Skylark DuQuesne. And Seaton and Friends need to deal with the problem of DuQuesne coming back. And that's kind of the basic idea of the story. So, let's see. Smith's previous book was serialized, in the series, was serialized in 1934 and collected into a single volume in 1949. So it's been about 15 years since Skylark of Valeron was last, seriously looked at by Doc Smith. And in fact, you'll find that there are some things in this book where, it seems like he either, didn't bring up or kind of forgot stuff that happened earlier in the series. For instance, the metal X, the special metal that can make other metals turn from matter into energy, was called Rovalon in a previous book, and he refers to it again as Metal X in this book, which isn't a big deal. It takes a fairly small part in the story, but still, it's worth noting that hey, I saw him mention Metal X. I'm like, wait, there was a name for that, and I had to go back and look at my previous notes to discover, oh yeah, it was Rovalon. Another thing about this book is that 15 years later, Doc Smith is a lot more, I guess, sedate than he usually is. His stories, his books have often been marked by kind of this almost ridiculous amount of energy, and this one's actually a little bit calmer, I would say, which is a big change in tone, and even a bit of a change in pace, which and it's not entirely a bad thing, because sometimes the excessively energetic method of storytelling that Doc Smith has can be a little bit like one shade shy of eye rolling, where you're like, I get it, yeah, okay, yeah, there's a bunch of crazy stuff happening, sure, but even though the writing in this book is a little bit more sedate, a little bit slower, a little bit less bombastic, there's still a lot of big events and huge numbers and crazy battles that we've all come to love in the series. I mean, we still get, we get, I've mentioned this before, but Doc Smith's dialogue has a tendency to sound like a parody of like a 1940s radio show where, you expect to see people with their pants up to their chests and talking really fast in vaguely New Yorkian accents. There's less of that in this book, but we still get a decent amount of Smith's trademark kind of slang and expressions. Not as much as usual, but there's still some of it there. There was one example in the book that I thought was really funny because it's one of those phrases that doesn't make sense on a couple of levels, right? Quote, someone is talking about doing something difficult. And he says he, quote, didn't stand the proverbial chance of the nitrocellulose dog chasing the asbestos cat in hell, end quote. There is no proverb about a nitrocellulose dog, and, the nitrocellulose dog is going to do pretty poorly in hell whether or not the cat is asbestos. So, it's one of those things where, it's so bombastic of a metaphor that that it's just, very funny. And there's a decent amount of that in the book. One of the things that Doc Smith was, I would say, not great at in previous books was changing POVs. And actually in this book he does a little bit better job, despite the fact that there is a ton of jumping back and forth and side to side and here and there and this guy and that guy and that guy and this girl and that person of like point of view. There's a lot of movement, but at the same time I think Doc Smith handles it a lot better than he usually does. And so despite the fact that the POV is constantly jumping around, and the characters are constantly jumping around in the universe, the flow of the story is still pretty well preserved. One negative point about the jumping back and forth is that not only are we jumping back and forth between different points of view, but we're also jumping back and forth across the universe, or even the cosmic all, right? Compared to a lot of other books that Doc Smith has written, I actually got a very kind of poor sense of like location and distance in this book. In a lot of books, he's kind of vague about it. It's like, oh yeah, we went at 100 million times the speed of light for 10 hours kind of thing. But there's still kind of a good sense of like, this is here, and this is here, and this is over here. In this book, everything that is going on is so far apart from everything else, and on such a massively ridiculous, oversized scale, that it kind of just feels like set pieces that may as well be on the same soundstage. There's never really any attention paid to or there's very little attention paid to like the time it takes to travel from A to B, or the difficulty in getting from B to C kind of thing. It's more like, let's get there, let's have an action scene, let's have some plotting going on, let's have some kind of cool thing happen, and then we'll move on to the next place, or the next character, or the next point of view. So, that's another slight downside about this book. Now, compared to other Skylark books, the tone in this one is a little bit darker, and a little less optimistic as well. The main body of the action contains a lot of like subterfuge and stealth and corruption, and it's done in kind of a more pessimistic tone than a lot of the other Doc Smith books have had, right? In the Doc Smith books, the good guys are the good guys and the bad guys are the bad guys, but this book in particular kind of puts a little bit more gray area into things, and makes things a little bit more complex where it can. It's not to say that there isn't any humor in the book. There's actually a few good laughs in the book as well. For instance, there's one point where Seaton basically has to come up with 7 aliases for his compatriots, his traveling companions, on the fly. And he says this, quote, "This is Hi-Fi Mocock, my wife. Low Test and High Test Crane, husband and wife," end quote. And then he came up with 2 other names to describe the other people who were there. And, everybody kind of laughs at him like referring to his wife as Hi-Fi. Even she is like, "I'm going to get you for that later on." It's pretty funny, actually. Let's see. This is the 4th book in the series, so the characters are familiar at this point. We kind of know where they stand. We know where they are. We know what they are like. There's not a whole lot of development, but the characters remain solid and consistent, and they do what you kind of expect them to do. Since the book is titled Skylark DuQuesne, it's not really a spoiler to point out that we get also a lot of his point of view, his perspective. And while he's treated and written as a definite villain, he's also treated seriously and consistently by Smith. So that's also a nice point about this story. Then, while this book does have a little bit more gray than other Skylark books, it still kind of keeps a good amount of Doc Smith's, good guys are good guys and bad guys are bad guys and never the twain shall meet. The twain meet a little bit in this book, but as usual, there's not a lot of gray to be had on a universal scale, where, even if DuQuesne is kind of, working with them a little bit, or maybe not, or maybe he's going to double cross, or who knows, or whatever, there's still, like, alien races that are just like, "Oh yeah, we're going to destroy everybody who isn't us," kind of thing. And those are the true evil to be thwarted, basically. Enemies of in the Lensman sense, enemies of civilization itself, basically. But then at the same time, there's also some enemies that are kind of like logical, but they have their own sense of logic, kind of thing. There's some of that as well. So there's a little bit more gray going on in this particular story as compared to the previous ones. Another thing that is thankfully missing from this book is like Smith's very almost kind of simplistic version of like leveling things up. Oh, it's a 2nd order this, it's a 3rd order this, it's a 4th order this. That's been one of the weak points in the books that I've read of Doc Smith so far, is that he has a tendency to just kind of like Dragon Ball Z power level things. Oh, this has a power level of 100. This has a power level of 10,000. This has a power level of 100 million. And there's not really a whole lot of like clarity about what the stakes are, or maybe there's clarity about what the stakes are, but like there's not a lot of clarity about what level things are at and how to compare X to Y and stuff like that. There's very little of that in this book. Where there is kind of like leveling up, it's actually handled in a very organic and kind of, storyteller-ish way, where like, oh, this is a thing that we need to learn how to do, and so we're going to learn how to do it, and this gives us these advantages, and therefore we can use these advantages to win this particular confrontation in this manner. It's actually really well done by comparison to a lot of the other books where it's been like, oh yeah, I just got you had a ship that was 100 kilometers across, and I'll have a ship that's 1,000 kilometers across, and we shoot enough laser beams at you to make your deflection screens to go purple and then black, and then they're gone, and there is some of that in the book as usual, but it's a little bit more. There's a little bit less of it, and where it's there, it's better justified. Maybe that's the way to put it. So once again, in general, Doc Smith's books have not been a particularly tactical perspective on fights, right? It's generally been this overpowering force against this immovable object, and we'll see who actually is more, unstoppable or more immovable, kind of thing. Once again, in this book, the tactics in most battles are pretty simplistic, but there are a few occasions where not just like complexity, but also like genuine planning and action and like subterfuge leading into action actually shine really well in this book. Including, there's a point in the book where Seaton and pals have to take over one small planet's government, basically do a coup, and this whole area is very detailed, not entirely one-sided, and really fun to read. It was really enjoyable. It was really interesting. It had a good pace, and it kept things going generally very, very well. As for general pacing, the book is, Doc Smith's books are always like, this cool thing happens, and then this crazy thing happens, and this other crazy thing happens. So, you're going to constantly be seeing something new, and the pace can be a little bit quick. But it's very, at the same time, there are lots of rest points where the pacing kind of slows down, and you get a lot of dialogue between characters. The dialogue is better than usual, and so, yeah, I really actually enjoyed this book quite a lot. In fact, as I was reading it, the way that things happen and kind of the way that the way that things are built up reminded me a lot of Star Trek: The Original Series, the TV show, because I don't know, there was just something about the way that things were thought about, and the way that the things were written about, and the way that the pace kind of had these very, not necessarily predictable, but like efficient ups and downs in pacing and stuff. And I know that the original series came out like a year and a half later or something like that, but I wonder if this book was influential on any of the writers who happened to be writing for the Star Trek original series when it first was coming out. And probably they did. This book was nominated for Best Novel by whatever body does the Hugo Awards. So yeah, it was a pretty good read. It felt a little bit longer than some of the other books, but it kind of kept things going in a interesting and it encouraged you to keep reading. I didn't feel bored at any point reading the book. I actually found it fairly interesting. There are enough cool things happening that that whatever kind of negative points there are in the book, which I'll get into a little bit more in detail in the spoiler section. Whatever negative points are in the book, first off, they were the typical weaknesses of Smith's writing are less on, they're less evident in this book. He really grew as a writer, basically, and so it was a really good. It was a really good Doc Smith book, and it was a really good book in general, is what I would say. So, with that said, let's move on to the spoiler section. I'll get into a little bit more detail. As always, feel free to skip it if you haven't read the book and you want to keep things as a surprise. All right, the spoiler section. So, as I said in the non-spoiler section, DuQuesne is probably coming back. Of course he's coming back. The book is titled Skylark DuQuesne. What happened is that the stasis pod that they put DuQuesne and those bodiless intelligences in basically kept accelerating faster and faster to the point where it would eventually hit basically a little puff of rarefied hydrogen, and it would have to burn up all of its energy to do that. So, it's one of those things where it's he'll go off into space for infinity and we'll never see him again. And then it turns out that within a year, basically, he's back in action. And the scientific reasoning there was kind of cool, actually. It's well, if let's say that we have a computer that can react in a certain amount of time, right? And it's a really, really quick reaction. It's 1/300 billionth of a second or something like that, right? Sure. And then but the problem is that this thing is not moving at constant velocity. We have it accelerating. And so as it accelerates faster and faster, assuming no light speed limitations, it will eventually reach a point where it cannot, even though it tries to route around things, it will eventually reach a velocity where the detection of an obstacle will be too slow for it to route around. That's kind of just a limitation of the fact that the velocity is increasing while the reaction time is remaining constant. I thought that was actually really neat, where it's eventually it'll be going so fast that even if there's a rarefied cloud of cosmic hydrogen that's, as opposed to 10 to the minus 14 interstellar space, it's 10 to the minus, 11 hydrogen, in Tor, right? It's that'll be enough to number one, create enough resistance that it'll burn through all its fuel. And it's also going so fast that it won't have time to dodge it. as compared to the other times where sometimes Doc Smith has just kind of been like, no, this is what really happened. This was actually pretty well done, I think. So, points for that. And so the solution is, well, DuQuesne's not there. DuQuesne's not back yet. But, basically, the question is, what is he going to get from those bodiless intelligences, and what advantages is that going to give him? And so the solution that Seaton and friends comes up with is to basically send out this telepathic signal for help. They're like, we need to learn something that will give us an edge over DuQuesne. And at the same time, this telepathic message needs to be sent out in such a format that it doesn't call, potential enemies in and say, hey, I have this weakness, come and exploit this weakness. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily the most, ironclad logic, but there's a lot of explanation and worry, and there's a lot of we have to craft it to do this, and we have to make sure that only these people can detect it, and I think that was a cool touch. It worked pretty well. Once we've established the whole situation with DuQuesne and that telepathic message, we move point of view over to a group of people who are called the Jelmy. These are basically human-like people who are under the thumb of a group called the Lurdy. And the Lurdy are weird. These are one of these enemies that has they're extremely logical, but they have their own sense of logic. And the Lurdy basically say, oh, the Jelmy are not logical like we are, and therefore they must be subjugated and controlled. But they also are like, well, we'll give them as much freedom as they can have, because the Jelmy are also really good at having these intuitive leaps in logic that lead to massive technological advancements. It's kind of an interesting interplay there. And so the most intelligent, I think it's 800 of them, of the Jelmy, are taken by the Lurdy and put into it's like the mouse experiment, right? It's an environment where they have everything they could possibly want, and any desire that they have is almost instantly gratified kind of thing. And yet at the same time, because the Jelmy recognize that they are still captives, they refuse to work. They refuse to get things done. They refuse to make the advances that the Lurdy are asking them to make, even though the Lurdy often use these little they describe it as like a nerve whip. It's basically a method where you can kind of cause discomfort without causing any physical damage. Kind of a harmless prod, basically. And here we get into kind of the difference between what the Lurdy call sanity and insanity and unsanity, and it's never really quite obvious or clear what the exact difference between insanity and unsanity is, but Doc Smith likes this language, and so he uses it a lot. That when someone is acting, insane, they're totally chaotic, but when they're unsane, they're systematic but illogical in a systematic way, I think. I don't know. There's never really a clear, concrete definition, but the language gets used a lot, and it sounds nice, at least, at the very bare minimum. So these 800 Jelmy decide that what they're going to do is they're going to basically revolt against the Lurdy that are capturing them, and this is another interesting part of the book because they basically build a bunch of guns and grenades and blow a hole in the wall of one of the Lurdy council chambers and just shoot a bunch of them. And it's like, we want our freedom, blah 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 blah. And the Lurdy are just like, oh, you killed a bunch of us, huh? Okay, you guys can go. Hey, for all the people that are dead, your first assistant becomes the post that you had before you were dead, and their reaction to it is very weird, and I like that, right? Where they're like, oh yeah, there's no logic in crying over these people. Obviously the Jelmy, we let them do this. We didn't properly defend ourselves against them, so that's kind of our fault. And then. Well, we're just going to rebuild our organization, and we're going to let them go. We're going to let them go, and they're not going to know whether they're free or not, but maybe they'll actually come up with something useful, and maybe we'll learn something about it. And that part of the book is left a little bit, I guess, unclear, or, it's not really sure whether the Lurdy are tracking the Jelmy that get away. But there's also a bunch more Jelmy that are kind of like in colonies that are still trapped. And these, like, what's left of the 800 after the firefight ends basically go off to try to figure out some other way to deal with this situation. So around this time, we learn that DuQuesne has finally gotten free, and it turns out this is another retcon thing where one of those disembodied intelligence is like, oh yeah, Seaton thinks that he did this to you and made you incorporeal, but actually it was me, so I'm just going to make you corporeal again. And there's this great scene where DuQuesne gets his ship back, and he's like looking around his ship, and he's looking at his body. He's like, no, all my little scars are still there. And he like goes into the bathroom. He's like, no, I remember that the toothpaste tube was squeezed in this particular way, and they even recreated that. It's actually kind of fun and funny, and it's one of the very rare humorous moments around DuQuesne. So it's kind of it's very welcome, I guess is the way to put it. And as DuQuesne gets his body back, it turns out that there's also another group that hasn't been quite as thwarted as we all thought they were. The Fenachrone are actually still hanging on too. It turns out that before Seaton destroyed their entire planet and all of their civilization and ships, there was a group that got away a little bit ahead of schedule, which allowed them to kind of continue to survive as a small fleet of ships, basically. So that's something that is another kind of retcon-ish thing, where we've seen a lot of this in these books so far. But the funny thing is that these remaining Fenachrone actually get captured by the Lurdy. The Lurdy are like, hey, these guys seem really, really kind of intransigent, and we might have to destroy them. So the Lurdy basically destroy 90% of the remaining Fenachrone, and then capture the rest in basically the same kind of conditions that the Jelmy were put in earlier. And so now the Fenachrone are in a situation where they're kind of languishing for a lack of freedom as well. It's kind of an interesting thing where Doc Smith is basically proposing that intelligent races can't be their best without some level of actual freedom, and I'm personally sympathetic to that kind of message. But at the same time, he also shows that even the Fenachrone are kind of trapped by this reality of how things have to be for intelligent life to kind of flourish. So that's also kind of interesting. Now, DuQuesne basically, right after he gets his body back, he starts going to look for the Fenachrone or something, but whatever happens, he basically runs across the Lurdy and they attack him. And so he runs away from them, and he basically calls Seaton for help. And he sends out one of the 6th order mind messages to Seaton. It's like, Seaton, respond on a tight beam, 6th order, whatever, as soon as possible kind of thing. Seaton receives the message, and he is tentatively forgiving. But one of the major weaknesses of this book is that where there could have been ambiguity and tension, Doc Smith does not really allow that to happen in the relationship between Seaton and DuQuesne. When, Seaton is forgiving and DuQuesne seems to be kind of friendly, but at the same time, Doc Smith gives us enough of an internal view of DuQuesne's state of mind that we know that he's planning a double cross. So unfortunately, where there could have been some really good tension, there's actually none of it, basically, because Doc Smith spoils it all by putting us in DuQuesne's shoes for long enough that we know what he's planning. So while this is all going on, those Jelmy that escaped land on the moon, and they build a new warship there. Their plan is to develop some kind of new technology and then bring it back to the Lurdy to convince the Lurdy to allow the other Jelmy to have freedom as well. Once they land on they land on Earth's moon. The reason they go to Earth is because Earth is putting out more of this 6th order wave stuff than anywhere else in the galaxy, and so they're like, oh, well, that will provide cover for us. Even if they're trying to observe us, that extra emanation from Earth will help to hide us, or at least obscure what we're doing, which will make it harder for the Lurdy to kind of keep an eye on us, and so that's their plan. What they do is really funny. They abduct 2 people from Earth to study them, and this is one of those points where where one of the weird and funny points of the Skylark universe really comes into clear focus, where for some reason, for whatever reason, I don't know why Doc Smith did it this way, but basically almost every alien other than humans are practically nudists. And it's not there was a lot of like salacious material in early science fiction where it's like, oh, this is kind of, to draw in the readers who we know what our audience kind of wants to see and hear and think about, right? And this is kind of, enticing, right? And like Doc Smith does the same thing, but he does it in such a clinical way that it's never really like, you never really get the feeling that like, like if you're watching the Star Trek, the original series, there's obviously points where the camera is pointed at a woman, and you're supposed to believe that that woman is very, very attractive for whatever reason. And like, there's no attractiveness in the way that Doc Smith like portrays what's going on, and there's no, it's not really salacious either. It's too clinical and clinical clearly by design. This is something that he set up, for some kind of reason, and it's funny because it doesn't give. It has a similar, like, net effect of what the salacious material in early science fiction did, but removing all of the parts that made it, enticing to people to read, right? Which I always found very strange. But in this book in particular, and there's never anything explicit in these books, right? It's always like, the kind of the literary equivalent of the camera pans away and fades to black kind of thing. We've seen that happen kind of sort of in the other books. In this book, there's a lot more of it. A bit later in the book, DuQuesne puts on a disguise and meets up with a Jelmy and, donates some of his DNA, if you get my meaning. And so it's just weird. It's just strange. Like, it could just not be there and it'd be fine. And it is there, but it's written in such a way that it doesn't do what those elements of those books are usually intended to do, which, like, is very confusing about what the purpose of it is then. It's not done that way. I just don't get it. So I don't know. It's not bad, and it's not, it's not scandalous in any way. It's just weird, and I've never understood why Doc Smith did it this way. And maybe, maybe he's doing it because he wanted to show it, but in a, like, kind of a documentary way, I guess. I don't know, kind of like but like the rest of the book is as far away from the documentary tone as you can get, and so it's like, I don't know. It's just, this is how he wrote these for some reason, and that's just what it is. So anyway, getting away from that. Finally, DuQuesne springs his plan to kill Seaton and friends, which is a very basic plan. He goes to Earth and he hires like 6 guys with literal like Colt 45 pistols and says, "All right, you guys go kill Seaton. I'm going to teleport you in." Because the Jelmy develop a fourth. We've seen this fourth dimension like translation shift thing in a previous book where like everything was weird and it was all strange and it didn't work very well. But the Jelmy finally figure out how to do teleportation using the fourth dimension. And real teleportation, like instantaneous, from one place to another kind of thing. So basically, DuQuesne gets this information from the Jelmy, and then he decides to use that information to build the device. Then he's going to take these 6 guys and send them over to Seaton's dining room while they're eating and have them all get shot. And the funny thing... Well, there's a couple of interesting things about this. Number one, the attack by DuQuesne on Seaton fails, of course, but it seems to trigger another big attack on Seaton. It's one of those giant. Oh yeah, and then suddenly the Skylark of Valeron was hit by a beam that evaporated the top. The outer 1,000 kilometers of it in merely 3 seconds, kind of thing. It's kind of one of those things. But here's another thing that's very strange. The reasoning for why or how DuQuesne's gunman missed Seaton and friends is absolute bunk. Let me just go through this real quick. So what happens is that these guys go in, they get teleported in, and they get basically one shot at all of the people that are sitting around Seaton's dining room table. And by the time they are about to get their second shot, Seaton's people have reacted, and Seaton's people are much more skilled in general, so, Seaton's people win out. But they do get that one shot off, and they all miss. And the reason that Doc Smith gives is that, they have to correct for gravity, and it just so happened that the Seaton's people were in a low-gravity environment at that time because they had guests who preferred lower gravity. But here's the thing. All right, these are trained gunmen, and I'm not like super. I'm fairly knowledgeable about guns. I've taught courses and I've been an instructor at ranges and stuff like that. But I'm not like super amazing at it. But even I know this. Okay, the average 45 ACP round is going around 800 to 900 feet per second. It's a relatively slow round, but and from physics we know that basic gravity is 32 feet per second squared on Earth. That would be the normal gravity that a shooter on Earth would be used to. But here's the thing. Even if we went all the way to zero gravity, and we didn't, and Seaton's group didn't go all the way to zero gravity, they still had some gravity for their guests who preferred lower gravity, but still not zero. Over the length scale of a dining room, the correction for height because of gravity is practically zero. Let's say that we have a very large dining room. It's 40 feet across. Well, the bullet travels 40 feet in 0.05 seconds, and the bullet drop over that period of time due to regular gravity is 0.04 feet, or about half an inch. And so, like, if you on that length scale, 45 ACP may as well be a laser beam. You're still going, if you're aiming it for the center of someone's nose, you're going to be half an inch off, but you're not going to be off and missing entirely. If you aim for center of mass, you're still going to hit. And so Doc Smith kind of says that, people correct for gravity when they're shooting, but in reality, that is something that you do with the sights of the gun. You zero it for 25 yards or 50 yards or 100 yards or 200 yards, depending on what your application is. And, you move the sight up and down until the bullet goes where it's supposed to go at the range that you go, and over that range it's making some kind of an arc where, generally speaking, at shorter ranges it's a little higher, and then it reaches, and then it crosses the sight at the sight that you sight at the distance you sighted it in, and then beyond that it's lower. Fair enough, but like. Doc Smith seems to be suggesting that people deliberately move their hand as they're firing in order to correct for gravity, and that is exactly the opposite of the thing that good shooters do. Good shooters call that movement a flinch, and it is something that, because it's so because the amount of time that the bullet spends in the barrel of the gun is so short, you can't reliably and repeatably move your hand in the proper amount to compensate for recoil that way. Generally speaking, you want to you want to just have a solid grip and a solid view on the sights with the front sight in focus, and then fire without, pull the trigger without adjusting, without twisting anything, which is harder to do than it sounds, especially if you're doing it rather quickly. And then, you want to take the recoil and get back on sights as quickly as possible. That's how an actual shooter does it. Smith's explanation is complete nonsense, and doesn't make a whole, and even if gravity went to zero, you still would expect these people to have hit everybody. So, they don't, and that's the reason that the story can continue to go on. But it is something I noticed and had to say, that's just flat wrong. So anyway, the question that arises now is, when DuQuesne's attack went off, that second attack came, and it was very, very powerful. And it wasn't DuQuesne, so who was it? Well, there's a bunch of detective work that goes into this, but basically, it turns out that it's more of these chlorins, the amoeba-like creatures that were antagonists in a previous book. And basically, I'm going to kind of move quickly from here, but the rest of the book is basically about figuring out how to fight these chlorins. The chlorins are more dangerous than the Lurdy because they're simply hostile to every other race than themselves. They're inhuman, they're cruel, they're monstrous, yada, yada, yada. And so now that we know that the chlorins have actually survived, and we need to know what their plans are, what the prognosis is. Are they going to spread throughout the universe or what? And, basically, if they're going to spread throughout the universe, then they need to be stopped. That's the basic run of the rest of the book, and we're at about the halfway point as far as the actual contents of the book go so far. So the chlorins have an immense amount of offensive and defensive power at their beck and call, and so the rest of the book is about trying to figure out how to counter that. And that's, about half the book. And the path there includes a lot of like sneaking around and combat and fighting corruption, actually, in a few places. We get more uses of this fourth dimension teleportation device by the Jelmy. In fact, they return to Lurdy space, and they use it to force a deal with them. They're like, hey, we can now teleport, and if you don't give every Jelmy their freedom, we're just going to teleport a bomb into all of your planets, and you're all going to die. And they're like, oh, that's logical. All right, fair enough, you're all free. This leads to a very funny kind of diplomatic whoopsie later in the book, where the Jelmy and the Lurdy have already made peace, but then Seaton goes to go talk to the Jelmy, and when he's doing that, the Lurdy detect him, and they get into a fight. And basically, they have to, Seaton has to kind of go through the Jelmy and be like, hey, can you tell these guys to stop shooting at me? And the Jelmy are like, oh yeah, sure, hold on a second. And they're like, oh, it's good that you didn't destroy them entirely, because you probably could have. And if you did, then our whole diplomatic effort would have been a failure, because, we would have gotten back into a state of war with them. That was pretty funny. Another element that happens is that DuQuesne basically saves the Fenachrone from captivity by the Lurdy, and then he kind of reaches an agreement with them to work for him for a while, and then he'll give them some technology and they can go off on their own. But there's an interesting element where the Fenachrone had this point of view where they were like, we are the most powerful, we are the best at everything, and therefore we should conquer the entire universe. And one of the cool things that DuQuesne does is kind of break them of this particular point of view, or this particular mindset. Basically, he has to show them, because one of the things that he did in the earlier book is he did the mind transfer thing with some of the Fenachrone. So Doc Smith is like, well, DuQuesne is more Fenachrone than any other creature in the universe except for Fenachrone themselves. And so DuQuesne basically has to out Fenachrone the Fenachrone to convince them to stop trying to take over the universe, and kind of, if not friendly, to be at least peaceful and non-aggressive toward other races, or else I will kill you, kind of thing. It's a great little chunk of the story there, where we get to see DuQuesne do something very DuQuesne-esque that, like, Seaton's methods wouldn't have worked well with the Fenachrone, but DuQuesne's methods do, and it's because they're so similar that they work well, and I found that to be very fun and interesting. Another major chunk of the book is taken by this plan to overthrow the government of a planet called Racine. And the reason they're doing this is because they basically need a forward base within the galaxy where the Chlorans are working. And so the Racine planet is a planet that is currently enslaved by the Chlorans. And Seaton's idea is to kind of get information and a foothold by taking this planet over and flipping the government to being one that's kind of pretending to be in favor of the Chlorans, but not so. And this whole sequence is very well done. It is up there with the best disguises of Kim Kinnison. And it's really, really well done. There's a lot of stealth, there's a lot of planning, there's a lot of subterfuge, there's a lot of subtlety. It's very, very interesting and enjoyable to read. It's very well done. So, while the coup of Racine is actually really cool, it actually does something else, which, how can I describe this? The continuing consequences of the coup of Racine lead to the discovery of something that the characters in the book pretty much just call witchcraft. And they kind of mean it. It's like this... It's not well understood. There's no scientific justification behind it. There's not even like the vestige of a scientific justification behind it. Unlike a lot of things that are in this book and in Doc Smith's books in general. No. But this is the funny thing about this is that it's kind of almost a little bit of a Deus Ex Machina, where it turns out that there's this ability that some people have that we can learn kind of how to do, but not how it works. But then we can tap into it to turn it into a really, really powerful weapon against the Chlorans. And then they basically annihilate the Chlorans completely. Or at least, I guess since Doc Smith is dead, there's not ever going to be a retcon on the Chlorans coming back. But, it is done in the very typical hyper-bombastic Smith battle, which, to Seaton's character's advantage, is made extra simple by the fact that the Chlorins always live on separate planets from the races that they subjugate, right? Like, around a particular star, there will be a Chlorin planet and a non-Chlorin planet, and the Chlorin planet takes all the, good stuff that the non-Chlorin planet produces for them. It's one of those things where we've seen Seaton attempt to completely destroy the Phenochrone before, so this is not entirely, alien to his character, but it is a bigger version of that than we've ever seen before. And I'll leave it at that. It's kind of worth reading for being one of the most over-the-top things Smith has ever done in one of his books, and also still having a little twinge of care or like precision to it, rather than simply blowing up a whole galaxy kind of thing. So yeah, I think we'll call the spoiler part there, and we'll move on to the conclusion. Okay, in conclusion, I've read a decent number of Doc Smith books, and I actually think that from like a purely literary perspective, this one is one of his better works. It doesn't quite have the pop that a lot of his earlier works have. It's a little bit more sedate, but from a writing and plotting perspective, I think it's very well done, and it's a little bit more like carefully written. I'll put it that way. A lot of Doc Smith books you can kind of perceive as just being kind of like blah 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 slammed together, and lots of bubblegum and duct tape kind of thing sometimes. Whereas, and a lot of his stories have things where it's not quite, an eye roll thing, but you kind of like, oh, there goes Doc Smith again talking with his crazy slang, or there goes Doc Smith again making some kind of, silly, somewhat silly thing happen over here just because he likes to do silly stuff like that. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in his earlier books that doesn't really translate well to a more modern perspective, and this book actually translates pretty well to a modern perspective. It's a post-1940s end to a pre-1940s series, if that makes sense. It's a little less energetic, but it's a little bit more deep and a little bit more satisfying, with a few caveats here and there, where Doc Smith could have made something a little bit more tense, but he doesn't, because he prefers to, view a larger multitude of points of view rather than keep one hidden for the purposes of dramatic tension. And fair enough. Here's the thing. This is the last book that Doc Smith ever wrote. It is the fourth book in the Skylark series. Doc Smith also wrote the Lensman series. If you've read other Doc Smith books and you found him a little too over the top, and you were like, oh, this is, it's okay, but like it's a little too much for me, the way he does certain things, you might actually find this book more tolerable than his other books, more interesting, because the things that Doc Smith typically goes over the top with, the crazy space battles, which are basically just giant beam versus giant beam, and which one wins, there's less of that in this book. It's a little bit more interestingly done. There's a little bit more attention to detail. The tactics are still pretty simplistic, but there's a little bit more going on under the surface in this book. And so, if you're a hesitant Doc Smith fan, but you still kind of like his work, you'll probably enjoy this work for being a little bit less over the top. On the other hand, if you've been putting off finishing the Skylark series for whatever reason, read this immediately. It's a really good send-off to the whole series. We get a lot of different character events. We get a lot of different interactions. We get a lot of cool stuff happening, a lot of crazy, here's a whole galaxy of this kind of monstrous alien and stuff like that. There's a lot of neat stuff going on. It's a lot of fun. And while still being a little bit less over the top than a lot of the earlier Skylark stuff, it still maintains enough of that flavor that it is definitively a Doc Smith book, definitively a Skylark book. And, it's got that nice mix of there's a little bit of real science. There's a lot of humor. There's some weird slang that you kind of like, oh, Grandpa's making funny jokes again kind of thing. Dad joke-ish kind of stuff sometimes. And at the same time, there's a little bit more attention to detail. There's a lot of the good elements of what you've I'm now speaking to a person who's been putting off finishing the Skylark series. There's a lot of stuff in here that is stuff that you've probably liked in Doc Smith's other books. And so, if you said, oh, well, Skylark DuQuesne came out so much later, I'm not sure I'm interested in reading it, yeah, you'll probably actually like it. So, classic sci-fi, Doc Smith's last book, worth a look if you're interested in historically important sci-fi at all. Different from previous Doc Smith books while still maintaining a lot of that spirit, but kind of muting a little bit and poking at things in unique ways that make this book a rather different read from the other Doc Smith books, where I kind of, at some point, you kind of come to expect what's happening in the Doc Smith books, and this book is a little bit different from that. So that's what I'll say for this one. Hope you enjoyed the review. Yeah, that's what I've got for this week. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and happy reading. See you next time.